Hello, I'm Shannon Hopkins, one of the co-founders of Rooted Good. My colleague Mark Elston and I are co-hosting this season of Igniting Imagination. We are so thrilled that Wesleyan Impact Partners is letting us do a whole podcast season related to church buildings, land, and new economic models. We believe in the good futures that are possible for churches across America, that this is a moment of opportunity and possibility.
Our work at Rooted Good is all about helping churches reimagine the use of their buildings and land, generate new forms of income as a way of fulfilling their mission and purpose, and serving their communities in new and creative ways. As we've been working with churches all across America in every corner of the country, we keep meeting people who are pioneering a new future, people that are showing how the future can be more exciting than the past. This season is full of amazing stories of churches rising to this moment. We are seeing congregations and leaders that are serving the Big C church in perseverance, passion, creativity, courage, renewal, and rebirth.
And today's guest is Reverend Dr. Joe Daniels. He's the pastor of Emory Fellowship in Washington, D.C., which is one of those churches that has done amazing work in their community. He's an inspiring leader, and his church really is a beacon of hope. We couldn't do this season and not have Joe in the lineup. You're going to love his story. And this conversation focuses on legacy and why legacy is critical to this work. So I'm so excited about this conversation with Joe. But before we dive in, Mark, what stuck out to you as we talked to Joe?
Yeah, I love Joe's story of the journey that Emory Fellowship went on building the Beacon Housing Center that he talks about, and that they have done to transform their neighborhood. I mean, this is a story that stretches back hundreds of years, actually, in a way that it gives me goosebumps every time I hear him talk about it. And it also stretches forward, right? So I was really struck by the fact that this question of legacy is both one of kind of the previous legacy of a congregation and how does that inform what it does with its buildings and land today, but also what legacy does a congregation leave in its community into the future? And that kind of long view of the way a church and a congregation uses its property, its buildings, its land, its assets for the good of the neighborhood and the good of the other is just such a powerful story. And Joe lives it. He's been a part of it. He's seen it all, everything from preaching about it to city meetings to fundraising to designing buildings, all of it. I mean, all of it. He's the real deal.
He really is the real deal. And the other thing that I loved about this conversation was he kept talking about context, the place that the church is at, and how important that is. And that keeps coming up episode after episode after episode. So we don't want to take any more of your time. We want you to hear this conversation with Joe. So let's dive in. Hi, Joe.
How are you?
Yeah, really well. And so delighted that you're with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. In this podcast, we've been talking about this moment that the church is facing across the United States as it engages with the opportunities and challenges related to the building and land that churches own. There have been a ton of stories in the news about churches closing, churches selling, and churches doing new development on their land. But you're not a stranger to this. In many ways, you've been pioneering and leading the pack. You led a church through a new kind of building project. I wonder if you could just tell listeners about your church, where you are, and about the Beacon Center.
Sure. I'm honored and humbled to be with you and Mark today. It's a great opportunity to be with you, and I'm grateful for the time. I've been pastoring the Emory United Methodist Church for the last 32 plus years, which is an anomaly in the United Methodist Church. as someone who's a pastor has been that long at a congregation, but it's been a wonderful marriage between pastor and people. We affectionately call ourselves the Emory Fellowship. We are located in the Ward 4 community, the Brightwood community of Ward 4 in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. We pursued several years ago, we pursued really in 2008, we pursued the Beacon Center, which is a 99 unit, fully affordable rental housing and commercial and congregational development project that we built. Um, we're finding that it is the largest project that's been a fully affordable housing project in the District of Columbia in decades, maybe even in history. All of our apartments are 60% average median income, meaning in DC, at the time that we built, the average median income was $120,000 a year for a resident of the District of Columbia. We build housing for people who make $70,000 or less, up to a family of four. This was the mission of our congregation, really to provide affordable housing for marginalized and disenfranchised people in the district, people who made a lower income, who were being displaced from the city because of the rising cost of living in DC. And so we're talking about people who are working the infrastructure jobs of the city, hotel workers, low-end teachers, low-end firefighters, low-end police officers, security guards, pastors, okay, barbershop owners, folks in that income level who keep a city going, who work very hard, who make a decent salary, but not enough to afford to stay in what has been called by many the number one gentrified city in the country. And so that has been our goal. That has been our effort. We're excited. Beacon Center opened in 2019. Praise be to God. We opened with a 500-person wait list. That wait list has gotten as large as 800. And now we're looking at building yet another project to address this issue of affordable housing in the District of Columbia using church land.
Joe, that's an incredible story, and what incredible work. And there's so many things I feel like I'd love to dive in on, like the time that it took, the wait list, it being connected to the mission of your congregation. But I want to go back to what you said at the beginning, which is you've been a pastor of Emory Fellowship for 32 years. When you went to Emory, was this the work you thought you were going to do?
When I arrived at Emory, I knew that I was in the process of a complete congregational and community revitalization effort. In fact, Emory had almost closed on 3 occasions, was almost sold on 2 occasions. And when I arrived there, the only thing that was keeping us open was a private school across the street from us, led by Mrs. Lillette Campbell. She was paying us $1,200 a month to use our fellowship hall for her school. Without that $1,200 a month, we can't survive. I went as a part-time pastor, making $14,000 a year. A good offering on Sunday was $300. A real good offering was $500. So we were really struggling to survive. I had no idea that I would be facilitating a $60 million building project where now almost 300 people live around us. Had no idea. But God is good. God is good. And we
Wow.
got to work. We got to work. We got to know our neighbors. We got to meet residents. We got to hear the heartbeat and pulse of our community, the Brightwood community. We began to feel people's heartbreak in our building of relationships with residents in the community, business owners in the community, people who came in and out of the community, congregants. The constant theme we kept hearing was, we need an affordable place to live. We need an affordable place to live. We had people who were homeless, who were sleeping on our steps or on our grounds. We had people who were transient. We started a transitional housing ministry for people needing a place to live, but the constant theme was it's too expensive to live here. We need an affordable place to live. Seniors were being priced out of the neighborhood because their property taxes were going up. And so we had an issue as a church that we needed to deal with. We had a mission, we had a vision, and I mean, we could worship on Sundays and go home and act like everything was well. But the fact of the matter is, people were hurting, and we had the gospel. We had the gospel of salvation, which in its original Greek language, sozo means to be made complete, to be healed, to be made whole. And so, if we're going to make help people become whole, we have to look at the not just the spiritual. We have to look at the physical, the mental, the emotional, the relational, and the financial. And so that's what we did as a congregation. We give God thanks that even as a working congregation of 400 people, we were able to build such a massive project to help as many people as we are. And we're looking forward to the next venture because it
Oh,
as you know too well, churches and other religious groups have just masses of property that are just sitting around that need to be repurposed and that can be repurposed in cities and suburbs and in rural areas in ways that can bless people in need. And that's what we're trying to do.
yeah, amazing. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question before Mark
Sure.
chimes in.
Sure.
I want to know, like, you started and you painted a picture of what the church was like at the beginning, like when you first went there before the building project. You were struggling to make ends meet, congregation of 400 people. What's it like today? What and how has the project impacted the life of the congregation?
It's amazing. And it's humbling. There are still many people, uh, who remember, um, who remember the grass not being cut for 6 years, who remember the broken bottles and beer cans lodged into the grass, who remember the used condoms and used syringes of the stairwell. And the very fact that the old sanctuary is still very much present keeps that reminder for people who've been around for a while. For those who are relatively new or those who came when we were worshiping at the school while the Beacon Center was being built, for those who are not aware of the history and they hear the history, they're just in amazement. Like, really, you all did all this. You came this far. We did all this. And it was like, yes. And so there's this excitement. Even now that we've come through COVID, there's still an excitement, a buzz because we've been deepening our roots in the community, getting more involved in mission. Affordable housing has been our thing, but we're now delving into food insecurity because that's a huge issue in DC. In fact, I was talking to the director of a food bank in town who said over the last month, food insecurity has increased by 37% in the District of Columbia. And so folks are hurting, and churches have a responsibility, a mission, a legacy to live out that helps people live whole lives. And if we do not do that, regardless of the size of our congregation, if we do not do that, we are missing the mandate of Jesus Christ that we've been called to as the church. And so there's excitement because we're seeking to be what the church is all about. We're seeking to be that entity where people grow spiritually, yes, but we're seeking to be that entity where, as in Acts 2, when folks had need, they knew where to go, and there were those who met needs and made sacrifices. And if they couldn't make the sacrifices, they pointed to other people who could provide the help. And day by day, there were added to those who are being saved. That's what we're trying to live out in real time. So there's an excitement around that. There's a challenge around that. The pressures are great. I'd lie to you if I told you this was easy work. This is the hardest work I've ever done in my life, because there are pressures and systems that are in place to keep people down and to keep people from not being able to be whole and to live affordably and to be able to eat every day, not worried about what bill has to be paid in order for me to have a place to live or to eat. And so that's what we're seeking to tackle in all of this. And so there's a buzz within our congregation and excitement, and it's a joy to be there. It's a joy to be there. I think every time I thought over 32 years my time was up, something would happen and God would say, "Your time is not up. You need to keep going."
Mm.
And so I've sought to keep going and to position the church such to where even after I retire, it can keep going. And so
Mm.
that's my hope and prayer.
Mm.
It's I love talking about this story and about your work, and I mean, we've known each other for quite a few years now, and you're always an inspiration. I want to talk a
Well,
little bit
thank
about legacy, but before, I just want to reflect on the fact that at Rooted Good, we hear from churches a lot, and they often feel overwhelmed, like, oh, we're so small, or we're so whatever, we don't have the income, we don't have this or that, and we how are we going to do this stuff? And it's just you know your church did it. I mean, with with very little income, with almost closing, with few members, with you know
by the grace of God,
yeah,
by the grace of
but
God.
it can be
Yes.
done. I mean, it can be
Yeah.
done, and that is
Yeah.
absolutely by the grace of God, and sort of some vision and leadership and all the things. But it's just, I think, just an encouragement that this work can be done, and really remarkable transformation can happen, even by churches that might feel like they're at the very end. You know.
Yeah. I appreciate your affirmation. It we sit back and we sit back and wonder, how do we do this? you know, but we had a remnant of people. I'll never forget Norma Vincent, who's still with us. She's our longest tenured member and one of our oldest members. Norma has to be in her mid to late 80s now and strong. And I'll never forget her saying when I first came to church, she said, "I just want to see my church revived." Like that. She said, "I just want to see my church revived." And so even in the midst of this struggle, just to keep our doors open, there was a remnant of people. And it wasn't a lot, Mark. It was, when I first started at Emory, I think my first Sunday there, maybe 50 people were in worship. Um, but there, even amongst that 50, there was a remnant of 30, 25, 30, 35 people who wanted to see their church do something. And that remnant kept propelling us forward. These were people of faith. These were people who gave what they could give. They sacrificed time. I remember even when we announced the building project and people were like, "How are we going to pay for this? What are we going to do?" And we had our first capital campaign. People took out second jobs to meet their pledges. We were, as I said, a working class congregation that, to our surprise, ended up raising $1.4 million to go toward this project. And, we're like, well, we raised 1.4, but we need 60. We don't have 60, but it was our work in community, building relationships amongst private sector, amongst government sector, in the public sector, sharing the vision, not just within the walls of our church, but sharing the vision within the greater Washington, D.C. community and saying, we have a collective problem here and we want to play ball. We want to do something about it. Here's 1.4 million. Here's our property. What can you all do in the private sector and the government sector to help us achieve this? And I think when churches, when if we look at, how are we going to do this within the cocoon of our congregation, our small congregation, it's not going to get done. But if we have the vision and the foresight and the courage and the willingness, the spiritual will to carry our vision out into the larger community, into corporate offices, into mayor's offices, into other governmental places, into places of philanthropy and the like, we'll find that our vision is much bigger than we are. Our vision is far greater than any of us, and that there are people who may never set foot in our congregations who share our vision and who want to see our vision come to pass. And that's what we discovered. We discovered that God was a whole lot bigger than just our little church on the corner, and that God's vision was a whole lot bigger than just the people in our congregation, but that God's vision is really worldwide, and that God will send partners from the strangest of places who see what you're up to and who want to be a part of it and who will even give to it. And so that's part of our testimony.
You talk really eloquently about legacy, and you mentioned legacy a few minutes ago. And there's sort of two ways in which legacy plays out, I think, sometimes in this and in your story. One is the legacy of what you have kind of left for the future in that location and on that piece of land. And I want to get to that. But I'm actually want to start with the legacy of kind of where it came from. And so I'll admit, I tell your story sometimes when I'm talking to folks because I just love it and it gives me goosebumps every time I talk about it. But could you just tell us a little bit about um, it gets all wrapped up in things like landmarking and all this other sort of really what feels like arcane kind of property development stuff, but there's something really deep and rich beneath it. And,
Yeah.
you there at Emory and the Beacon Center have built on a legacy that's hundreds of years old on that
Oh,
piece of
yes.
land. And there's something amazingly powerful about that. And could you just tell us that story?
Sure. So, the vision for us started, I was 2 years in, it was 1994. I was in a cleaners across the street, Tony's Martinizing, that's no longer there. I was holding a armful of clothes that I was needed to get cleaned. And just turned and looked out the window across the street to our church and the whole block. And all of a sudden, God just started talking to me, saying, one day you all are going to transform the whole block. At that time, we had a crack and heroin problem on the corner across from the cleaners. The street from the cleaners was considered crack alley and the like. And all of a sudden, God just started speaking this vision of how we were going to revitalize the community. I didn't know fully what it was. I came across the street, back across the street to church. I started preaching about it, teaching about it, getting people engaged and involved in community development and community organizing and training around that, not fully still knowing where it was going until the mid 2000s. And um, little did we know, if I fast forward into the project, here we are with this big vision this big vision started as 3 million and it went to 6 million, then it went to 9 million and it went to 18 million, then it went to 36 million. Then it was 54 million, 56 million, ended up 60 million. We're like, oh my God, we don't, we don't have this, but we kept going. And, our biggest adversary, we had cheerleaders all around town who wanted to see this happen, except one adversary, and that was the National Park Service. That's because our church sits next to a federal fort, Fort Stevens, which was the only fort that a sitting president visited during wartime, and that was Abraham Lincoln. Fort Stevens was a Union fort defending the White House on the northern side of the city. The Confederate Army was coming, and Lincoln was afraid that that White House would be overtaken. Um, he went to a woman by the name of Elizabeth Proctor Thomas, who owned the land that the fort would be built upon. And the fort was built, and as history goes, the Union Army fought off the Confederate Army, and history is the way it is. Most people would start the history of Emory and the history of Fort Stevens in 1860, when we were in the fight with National Park Service and historic preservation, and they didn't want us to build because our land buttressed a federal fort, we told them it would enhance the fort. We were literally shut down by historic preservation. Our project was shut down. It ended up costing us 2 years and $4 million in the process. We had Civil War buffs coming up from the South, from Florida and Georgia and South Carolina, saying that we couldn't build, that if we did, I'll never forget, one person testified that if I stood at the northeast corner of the fort, if we built the building, it would block the views of the Confederate Army marching down Georgia Avenue. And I quote, he said, "to save them niggers." And I was like, oh my God. And so in that hearing, we were shut down. But in the midst of it all, we got information about Elizabeth Proctor Thomas. And lo and behold, Elizabeth Proctor Thomas was a free African-American woman who, along with her grandmother, owned 11 acres of land all the way back to 1800. And so the land that our church sat on and the land that Fort Stevens was built upon, the land that Lincoln would end up taking from Aunt Betty, because he said to her, "We need to build a fort." He evicted her. The Union Army tore her house down, put her furniture under a tree where she lived for 13 years homeless. This land Aunt Betty owned, that was her name, her nickname. This land that she owned all the way back to 1800, she would house free Blacks and runaway slaves because there was nowhere else for them to go. In DC, DC at one point was surrounded by forts. It was known as Fort Circle Park. And so because of segregation, Blacks could not live on forts. Blacks lived in the communities in between forts. And so this 11-acre enclave of sorts that Aunt Betty owned was a place where she housed free Blacks and runaway slaves. And so essentially, she was housing people affordably all the way back to 1800. And so little did we know, but the vision that we were seeking to build that was facing opposition was a vision that Aunt Betty had started 220 years prior to us. And we had just stepped into a vision that had been going on all along, that we never knew about it until two park rangers told us about it. And with that, and with the grace of God working upon the Historic Preservation Review Board chair at the time, she came to us and said, we're so sorry that this got voted against. What are you going to do? I said, I don't know. You just shut us down. We don't know what to do. And there was just this long pause. And then all of a sudden she said, I think there may be a way. And we ended up coming back, doing some negotiation. And lo and behold, a few months later, we were going back before the board and we were unanimously approved to go forward. So it emphasizes, to your point, it emphasizes the importance of understanding a legacy that started way before you, really understanding the importance of context, of churches understanding historical context, geographical context, political context, relational context, biblical context, because context helps to inform what it is a church needs to be doing from a vision and mission point of view, but particularly churches that are undergoing projects like this. And you've written about it, Mark, so brilliantly in organizing your brilliant book, Gone for Good. It's important for us to know all of the contextual pieces that play into us using property that we have for the good, for the common good of people. Had we not known about Aunt Betty, we wouldn't have been able to go forward. And I think it has informed the legacy that we've been living and didn't even know we were living, and it informs the legacy that we have going forward. And as you know all too well, you know, when I did the chapter in your book and really looked at the word legacy, I discovered that it literally means persons delegated. And so when we are given a legacy or when we have a legacy, and we all have a legacy, right? Um, we are the persons who've been delegated to carry out the wishes of people who've come before us, uh, or people who will take what we've done and will have the responsibility for carrying it on. And this is so vital. This is so vital in what we do, lest we waste the assets that have been given us, lest we forfeit the assets that have been given us to people who are just trying to make a dollar, but who have no broad vision or foresight around how land and how property, whether it's for affordable housing or for a medical clinic or for a school or for something else, a voting center, whatever it is, can really make the difference in a community being a place of transformation and not necessarily a place of blight.
Yeah, I mean, so often I encounter folks thinking about talking as if they have to come up with some really new thing, some like brand new thing, some
Right.
flashy, fancy new thing. And in many ways, it feels like a very new thing. But what you're describing is this is a very old thing. It's a rooted thing. It's rooted in hundreds of years. And then it's also
Yes.
in your story rooted in the sort of 20 years you were praying about this and preparing for this and the prior. It wasn't like you just pulled an idea off the shelf or out of a book, right? You didn't just
Right.
pull an idea out of
Right.
a book and just plop it down there. It's rooted in like something much richer and deeper than that.
It's rooted in people. It's rooted in land. It's rooted in worship. It's rooted in the will and plans and purposes and visions of God. It's rooted in so many different places, and we have to do the contextual work and really, really, really dig to find what that is. I like to use a phrase that is often used by preachers in different places when we talk about context. I like to say that every text is written in context, and a text without a context is a pretext for a con. And a lot of people are being conned, and a lot of churches are being conned because we have skipped the step of context. And when we understand context, it literally fuels us forward to understand that we have legacies to carry out and we have legacies to leave. And if we are not faithful to that, even if we're the smallest church, even if we're the church in the country, even if we're the largest church, right? If we do not live out that legacy that's been given to us, informed by our context, then we end up compromising people's ability to be whole and to discover things that they would never discover unless we were faithful to the task that's been given to us.
So I have one more question about legacy, and this is sort of the forward-looking version of this, right? There are churches that are asking themselves, what is the legacy that we are going to leave here in this place in our land, especially in this moment where there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of the church or of a particular church, right? And that may that
Right.
that's not necessarily your exact context, but there are churches that are wondering, are we going to be here in 20 years? Are we going to be here in 10 years, 50
Yeah.
years, whatever it might be, right? And that's a valid thing to wonder, right?
Right.
Um,
5 years. Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a
Yeah.
question that folks are asking is like, if we all come back to this location 50 years from now, what's going to be here? And we, as the people of this stewards of this land and buildings and whatnot at this moment have an opportunity to shape that, what that legacy is going to be. And
Yes.
you've talked about a couple of things that really are interesting contrast in that, right? So you've left a legacy that's remarkable in the property that you're at there at Emory. If I remember correctly, you also talked to me once about the fact that the church you were ordained in is no longer there and there's something else there and you walk by and you've no idea what was even there. Could you just say a
Oh,
word about that and sort of the contrast between those different outcomes and the different ways in which that choice about um,
yeah.
the future legacy of a property, how that plays out?
Absolutely. So I worshiped at a church in Southeast DC. We're in Northwest DC, Southeast on the other side of the city, on Capitol Hill. We were on the edge of Capitol Hill, and um, what became clear is uh, that we were in a neighborhood that was changing. We were in a neighborhood that was gentrifying, Capitol Hill at that time. Capitol Hill, interestingly enough, to understand DC, you have to understand racial history, and that's in a lot of places in America because unfortunately our story has to do with race. Our country's story is built around racial issues, Native Americans, African slaves, and the like, and that's no different in our cities and communities today, in many of them. And so Capitol Hill in DC, which is where the U.S. Capitol is, the neighborhood around it. At one point, it was all black. It was all African American. Um, but with the economy the way it was over time and segregation, laws around employment, and the ability of blacks to get employment or get certain employment, laws written in place in DC around who can buy a home, who can't buy a home. I know my wife's uh, uh, my mother-in-law in the home that they owned in Northeast DC, there were literally codes written in the deed. You cannot sell to colored people. That was in the deed. We have that copy of that deed, and our family, thanks be to God, was able to preserve ownership of my mother-in-law's property. But um, because of situations like that, Capitol Hill became run down, and a lot of folks literally bought property for $1 and they built houses back up, and the neighborhood began to gentrify and blacks were being displaced from Capitol Hill. Wealthy whites were coming in. And the church had to make a decision. The church had to make a decision. Do we stay in this neighborhood that's changing all around us, or do we move to a community where there are more blacks, where there are more people like us? And this is happening in cities and neighborhoods across the country. Um, at Emory, it's starting to happen with us. We made a decision. We're not going anywhere. We're going to minister to the people, whoever it is, comes into our neighborhood. We're going to be a neighborhood together. These are every church has to make these decisions. The church where I worshiped 3 decades plus ago was faced with this decision, and it was 50-50 really in terms of what the church wanted, but the decision was made that the church would move to Prince George's County. And so this was a church I was ordained in. This is the church where I was nurtured as a seminarian in. So it has a lot of meaning to me. Um, I was telling you the story. I drove past there about 10, 15 years ago, uh, and they had sold the church and moved, as I stated, and the church was a condominium. And the only thing The only thing that reminded you that there was a church there was whoever bought the condominium named the condominium after the first name of the church. And so if you knew that that was the name of the church, then you knew. But if you didn't know, there's nothing at all. There's nothing at all to indicate that on this corner was this prominent church that sat up on steps. It was regal, right? But there's no sign that there was a worshiping community there. None. They're high-end condominium. And this is, to your point, this is what we're facing in a lot of situations. Hey, the property went for the good of those who are wealthy enough to buy it. Capitol Hill is prime real estate in the District of Columbia. Prime. 15 blocks from the Capitol we were. You could walk to the Capitol. But is it good for the community? Is it good for the neighborhood? Some would say, yeah. Others would say,
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
it's not easy. The decisions are not easy, but the legacy of those decisions has an implication and has implications for generations to come. Yeah.
Exactly. And in this case, and you're right, it's a very, very hard decision to make. Um, Lives are at stake, and there's an argument for, and there's an argument against. I mean, I can easily see the argument for the church relocating, and I would support that. I could see an argument for the church staying. I would support that. So it was a tough decision. Um, but but when legacy and when divine vision are at the core of the decision, and when the desire to have the greatest common good for the largest number of people is at the root of this decision making, I believe God prevails every time.
Amen to that.
Yeah,
But
amen
it's
to
hard
that.
driving past there and not seeing church. I tell you that. Like, whoa, where did my church go? I mean, my son was born into that church. My daughter was just a little teeny infant. I mean, there's just so many, memories. As Mark, you talk about, so one, there's so many memories in places like this, right? And all of a sudden the memories, boom, are gone. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. They're tough decisions, but they're decisions that we really need to step into, to pray into, and to make the informed decisions so that uh, the common good can prevail.
Yeah, amen. Okay, Joe, we're going to ask some rapid fire questions before as we start
Sure.
to land the plane. Um,
Okay.
okay, so we're going to go quick. I want to know, what would you say to other pastors that are facing decisions about using their buildings and land differently?
Repurpose your property. Don't hesitate. Learn everything you need to learn. Repurpose your property for the common good.
What would you say about the way seminaries are training pastors at the moment, as we prepare to sort of live into this new moment in the next couple decades?
Seminaries need to equip their pastors not to be managers of churches, but to be social and spiritual entrepreneurs who have social impact on the congregations they serve. Otherwise, we're wasting our time.
I love that.
Churches
So I
need,
love the social and spiritual entrepreneurs. That's yeah,
yes,
yeah.
they're, the business we do is grounded in the spirit. And so there must be the spiritual preparation of pastors and seminaries, must be, and everything that goes with that. But there must be the social impact, the social entrepreneurial preparation, because once a pastor gets into a community and gets into a church, they're going to be overwhelmed with community and economic development challenges. And unless there has been some equipping of pastors to be able to handle this, pastors will be overwhelmed and churches will be overwhelmed.
Okay. What's one thing that you wish people in the pew knew?
About what?
About this work, about the work of property development, church property repurposing.
I I I wish they would know and embrace the power they have to transform community and to transform people's lives within community.
What is one thing that you wish you knew back then, 20, 30 years ago, that you know now?
I wish I knew how to fundraise back then. I think that's one of the greatest gifts a pastor can acquire in these days, the ability to attract people to a vision and be willing to give to it.
Would you do it all again?
Without question. Uh, it has been a a wonderful journey, a powerful journey. It's an exciting journey. I still wake up in the morning excited about the next project I can impact. I wake up. I think at this stage of the journey, I can feel my passions shifting in a positive way, from you know just pastoring a church to pastoring a church into a building project through pastoring a church that's completed a building project. Now I feel like I'm getting to a point where it's time to hand off pastoring full time. Not yet, but I can see it coming, handing that off, but continuing the work of spiritual and social impact and entrepreneurship. And that's part of legacy for me.
Mhm.
Okay. Finally, we're asking all of our guests this season one question. As you consider the reality of the world and the witness of the church, what is your hope for the church?
My hope for the church would be to see that it is the center of unity, harmony, love, and life transformation for everybody. And that we realize that as we are able to partner with people, all people, as we are able to partner with people from all faiths, even not our own, as we're able to love one another as Jesus has loved us, the mark of what discipleship is, that we have the ability to not conform the world to us per se, but to transform lives in however God is leading that transformation. I, these are days and times we need to love people, and we need to stop dividing. We need to stop fighting against one another, but we need to see that we have much more in common than we do not in common. I can tell you a quick story if you have time. I was on a recent vacation, and I was on a recent vacation in Africa, and I won't tell you what country I was in, but it was a Muslim country, and I was touring, and I got food poisoning, and I got sick one day, and in that day, we had to pull over in the car because I was just sick. Our guide was Muslim. I was with Christian pastors, I had Christian pastors praying over me and Muslim imams praying over me. And I could feel the power of God bringing me back from sickness to health. I'll never forget that. Okay, most people say, "Oh, you had Muslim praying over you? How did you just?" Yes, I had a Muslim praying over me, and it was profound. So as we're able to unite people, love people, and seek a vision of God much bigger than ourselves, that's what the church needs to be about.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your work at Emory. Thank you for the legacy. Um, yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome. It's always a joy to be with y'all. Y'all as we say in the neighborhood, y'all are doing the doggone thing. Keep doing the doggone thing.
Thanks, Joe. It's been so great to talk to you.